Good afternoon, Jennifer McCreath speaking. Good, how are you? Excellent. Sure. Do you want me to give you like a full kind of biography of me and my life first, and then go into the politics? Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, I was born in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and raised in rural Nova Scotia, and spent many years living in Toronto, though, after my parents split. And 8.5 years ago, I moved to Newfoundland, of all places, to take on a better job opportunity. So I've kind of been around and seen a lot, big cities, small rural environments, a bit of everything. Growing up, I was always kind of shy and quiet, and knew I was different but couldn't really figure out how or why. I gravitated towards individual sports, played a lot of tennis and golf in my teenage years. Finally figured out for myself that I was trans and needed to go through the trans journey much later in life than most trans people. I was 33. No, I was actually still in Ontario. I went to Humber College in Toronto and got a diploma in business admin in 2000. And after a few years in the workforce, I went back to school and got my bachelor degree through Athabasca University in 2005. By that point, I had spent a couple years working in the private sector, in the banking business, and in retail hardware for a while, and had also had some work experiences in public policy. I have worked for the Government of Canada in a couple of different capacities, including a stint with Public Works as an accounting clerk, and with Service Canada processing EI claims, interestingly enough. I've also worked for the provincial government of Ontario in a variety of different departments over the years. Most of my work focused either on information management, privacy, and records management, as well as some time looking at electronic service delivery, e-government, streamlining service delivery. So once I realized I needed to transition, I knew I needed to do two things. I needed to get in better physical shape, and I needed to find a better job because I knew the healthcare system was not likely going to help. So after being a couch potato for many years, I took up distance running and managed to drop 75 pounds in 6 months and became a marathon runner in the process. And it was right around that time that I had literally sent resumes looking for work all over the country because I just couldn't seem to climb up any corporate ladder in Toronto, and a great job opportunity popped up in St. John's, Newfoundland, of all places. So I said, okay, I guess we'll go to Newfoundland. We'll be a senior policy analyst, which at that point in my life was the best job I had ever had. Never actually thought I would stay in Newfoundland very long. I figured I would build up the resume, save up some money in the bank, and then go back to either Toronto or another big city. But once I got out here, I fell in love with the place and decided, you know what, I'm going to stick around here, and I need to start this transition. I can't really wait any longer, so I put in motion a complex plan of announcing to everyone in my life, both in Newfoundland and elsewhere, that I was coming out as trans, and I'm going to go through this process, and the next 5 years of my life, here's exactly what's going to happen to me. And in 2007, trans stories in mainstream media was still a rather kind of taboo subject, and I was fortunate enough to work in the government IT department at the time, and one of the directors had a daughter who was working with the local television station, and said, my daughter would love to do a story on you. And people were saying, oh, you better be careful with the media. But I kind of felt this is someone I could probably trust and work closely with. So I had a good chat with a TV journalist, and she basically said, Jennifer, I don't know much about this. You tell me what you think the story is. And I guess the thing with someone transitioning in Newfoundland who works for the provincial government, the story is so unique that it sells itself. You don't have to put any type of spin on it. So we ended up doing 3 nights in a row on 6 o'clock news for 5 minutes. Different chapters. Yeah, on NTV, Newfoundland Television. And so it introduced the topic of transgender, transsexual issues. It introduced me as a person who was living here and going through it, and talking about where I've been, where I am, and where I'm going. And also he talked about how I'm into marathon running and things like that. And it really helped give me a bit of a profile in the city and across the province. Instead of getting these funny stares and nasty looks, people all of a sudden recognized who I was, and people were actually strangers coming up to me on the street saying, hi Jennifer, how are you? I saw you on TV. Wow, I'm fascinated by your story. You must be very bold and courageous, and I wish you the best of luck. So it turned into a much more positive reaction. And unfortunately, the so-called safe and secure job disappeared on me less than a year after I was out. And I was never really given clear answers as to why, but I think we can all kind of figure out by reading in between the lines that somebody just didn't feel comfortable having a trans person in a high-profile senior analyst role in the public service. So rather than whine and complain or go to court and file any lawsuits or go to the Human Rights Commission, I decided, well, let's take a different approach. I knew it would be front page news. Transgender person loses government job. So I went to the newspaper this time and worked with them on a story that basically said, newly out transgender person is unemployed, looking for work. This is going to be an interesting journey. And once again, I think it gave more profile to me and to the transgender community. At this point still, there was only a couple of trans people in Newfoundland that I was even aware of, and none of them were kind of out publicly. By that point, I had also gotten involved with the local St. John's Pride Week organizing committee group, and took note of the lack of trans awareness among the gay lesbian community there. So I kept getting involved to the point where myself and a few other people decided it was time to take Pride from being this dark underground thing to more mainstream. And using my business admin background, we launched St. John's Pride Incorporated, a non-profit society. And in 2011 we had the biggest Pride celebration to date at the time in the city of St. John's, and the first time there were kind of big name corporate sponsors involved. Meanwhile, it took me a year to find another job, and I finally found one, but I went from being a senior analyst to being a file clerk who shoved paper into a scanner, but it was still at least a job. And I tried to be positive about that and continue to raise awareness and issues about challenges trans people face in Newfoundland. At that point, we had not had any human rights protection, nor was our healthcare system covering much, if any, of the procedures we needed, and our doctors were not familiar or educated on how to treat trans patients. So it basically, I evolved as being the spokesperson, shall we say, for trans issues, and I was always showing up at not just LGBT events, but it got to the point where I was getting involved in the community. I was a marathon runner. There's several running clubs that organize local 5K races, and at that point I had been good enough to run the Boston Marathon, so I show up to my local 5K in a Boston Marathon jacket. All of a sudden people take notice and say, wow, this person's got some impressive credentials here. And I further pushed, I took advantage of being a novelty. You take the word trans and throw it with just about anything and you've got a novelty. Trans marathon runner, wow, that's an interesting story. Trans person loves animals. Trans person interested in politics. And it got to the point where I guess in one area, a lot of the well-established gay and lesbian folks seem to resent me and my role with Pride, partially perhaps because they didn't like that it was a trans person running Pride, and I think there's also a little bit of hostility that I'm not a native Newfoundlander. They actually call me mainlander. You're not one of us, you're from the mainland, which is Canada over there. But it is what it is. Meanwhile, trans people start popping out of the woodwork. I went on my own. I created a grassroots trans movement called the East Coast Trans Alliance. I found similar trans folks willing to step up to the plate and be activists in Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and New Brunswick, and formed a bit of an alliance, and we took turns visiting each other's cities and holding publicity events, rallies, demos, protests, letter writing campaigns to the Departments of Health and the Departments of Justice. And I eventually gained a national profile as kind of being the trans voice for the East. And 2013, meanwhile, while I was working at the Crown Attorney's office, putting the paper in the scanner, I kept looking for better jobs. I get lots of job interviews, and I'm getting runner-up and runner-up. Actually won a couple of competitions only to have someone at the top of the food chain step in and veto the hire, and they would not even give me a legitimate answer as to why, citing a privacy and confidentiality. So, figuring that somebody was out to get me or somebody didn't want me, I realized I was going to have to focus on and broaden my potential employment search. And with my extensive family history of politics and public policy, it almost seemed like a natural fit for me to run in the municipal election that was happening. This is now 2013. My mom was a senior policy advisor for the Ontario government Department of Education for 25 years. My father was a federal elected politician in Nova Scotia in the late 80s and early 90s. So I've always, from the get-go, I've been raised in a world where paying attention to current events has always been important, and giving back to your country, your province, and your city has mattered. So I announced that I'm running for deputy mayor of the city of St. John's against a well-known, well-established business person who has been there before, and everyone said I didn't have any chance at all. And initially I couldn't get anyone to work with me. Nobody even wanted to sign my nomination papers. But 6 weeks later I walked away with close to 6,000 votes and 17% of the popular vote. I still think that there's problems. Trans people are not taken seriously by the media for issues other than being trans. It's amazing how many people wanted to talk to me about Caitlyn Jenner 2 months ago. Now that I'm running for federal politics, though, the focus seems to be on all the other candidates. And I know part of it has to do with the fact that I'm running for a relatively new and small party, but I can't help but wonder how much of it is, we can't take Jennifer seriously because she's transgendered. So it's hard to know really for sure, but I keep plugging away and doing my best to reach out to different people. I like to think that I can be a voice not just for the transgender community, but for any group of oppressed minorities. And my goal in this election is to reach out to those people who feel they don't have a voice, who feel that the main three political parties don't help them or don't represent their best interests. I want people who have never voted in their life to get off that couch and come out and vote for Jennifer McCreath. Sure. I'm actually a former card-holding member of both federal and provincial NDP parties. That goes back to the 2011-2012 time frame. And while I was there, I must sadly admit that I didn't feel welcomed or appreciated. From a federal perspective, I felt that Randall Garrison was trying to use the Transgender Human Rights Bill as his pet project of tokenism to get himself a bill, and not necessarily passing the right bill or a good bill. So that was a major problem I had with that. I also had concerns about the way certain members of the provincial NDP were handling their affairs, interfering in some cases with trans issues that I was working towards by engaging gay and lesbian organizations. Later on, I actually was a member of the provincial Conservative Party for a short time last year when they were looking for a new leader. There was one, even though it's not a party I've generally supported, there was a particular leadership candidate that I felt would be good for the province, so I supported his bid for leadership, and he did not win it. This was Stephen Kent, by the way. Shortly thereafter, our new Premier, Paul Davis, made a controversial appointment to his new cabinet by putting an unelected person in his cabinet, Judy Manning, for the Department of Justice. And I felt that that type of patronage was inappropriate and unacceptable, so I quit that party. So here I am, politically interested. I guess you could call me a political junkie of sorts, someone who wants to get involved in the political process but doesn't have faith or confidence in any of the big three parties. And I guess it was in early July I decided I'm gonna go to Google and Elections Canada and find a list of every single political party that is out there registered. And I'm going to read each and every one of their websites, and hopefully there'll be one party out there that has values and ideas that are congruent with who I am and what I feel needs to happen with this country. And when I saw what Strength and Democracy was looking to do, a light bulb went off in my head and said, this party has a great concept. This is exactly what I think Newfoundland needs. Specifically, Strength and Democracy operates under the idea that we will allow individual MPs to have a voice. We will not force them to tote party lines. We will not muzzle them. There will be no gag orders. Initially, the two founding members both left their parties. One was an NDP and one was a Bloc Québécois, because they felt that the party line went against the best interests of their constituents. And although they were, I guess, initially just looking at Quebec as their focus, I saw that the values cross the nation. And others have too. They now have a candidate in Ontario. I got in touch and joined the party, and not soon thereafter it was decided that I should be a candidate for them. And I think ultimately for the riding of Avalon in Newfoundland, where I'm running, we've seen a lot of interference by party headquarters. We've seen the Conservatives pick at the local, what do you call them, the riding association levels. They had a candidate lined up, a star candidate named Chess Crosby, and Stephen Harper's office stepped in and said, no, we're not going to accept this person as candidate. Meanwhile, you have the situation where the Liberal MP, Scott Andrews, was actually thrown out of the Liberal caucus by Justin Trudeau due to allegations of sexual harassment. However, there was never really any fair trial, and it was all done under a cloud of secrecy. So I thought, you know what, the people I know in Avalon are disgusted, and this is exactly not the way they want to see their next elected representative to be. So I decided that Avalon would be the riding that I would run in, partially because of the fit with the Strength and Democracy model, but also because it's a riding that is close to my heart. I spend a lot of time. I don't technically live in the riding. I'm about 7 or 8 kilometers outside of the riding, but I do spend a lot of time in the riding, and I have a lot of friends in the riding, and there's a lot of projects on the go and a lot of these little small towns and cities that I'd really like to help them see some growth. There seems to be so much focus on St. John's that all the other towns and cities kind of get forgotten sometimes, so I want to give them a voice. I have always been under the stance that human rights need to be absolute. The best practice around the world was to create the terms gender identity and gender expression and put them in human rights codes and human rights acts with no definitions, no exceptions, no exemptions whatsoever. Randall came out with a bill that only protected gender identity and not expression, and he had a definition thrown in there explaining what gender identity meant. Once you start to identify something, you're automatically starting to exclude people, and I felt that was not good enough. He argued that he needed to do that in order to get support as a private member's bill from some of the other parties. But ultimately I made it quite clear that we don't need to take steps backward. Either we do the bill properly or we don't do it at all. Because there are others that say technically all people are already covered under the grounds of sex. And then once it got into the Senate, they played around with it some more and practically butchered the bill to the point where it would be rendered useless anyway. But I just felt that the NDP was so focused on trying to be able to say we got a bill through that they weren't really listening to the concerns of the very members of the community that they're supposedly there to represent. They also seem to have a very heavy focus of gay and lesbian organizations speaking at the trans bill hearings, and they all seem to be out of Ottawa and Toronto. There was not a lot of voices heard or seen from around the country. Trans issues for a Newfoundlander could be very different, and they are very different than some of the issues faced by trans people who live in Toronto and Vancouver. It's definitely something that I would support. I can't say for sure whether it would be a bill that I would table. I guess we first of all have to wait and see what would the makeup of the House look like, and will Strength and Democracy have official party status or not. I'd like to hope that we're getting close to the time where trans rights is no longer a political issue. We've seen trans rights recognized across the country at the provincial level in more than half of the provinces now, and we've seen all three major party stripes at the provincial level. We've seen NDP governments, we've seen Liberal governments, and we've seen Conservative governments proclaim transgender human rights at the provincial level. So I'd like to hope that no matter who forms the government on October 19th, that whoever puts forward the bill, that it will get support and that it will be passed, because Canada likes to brag about being leaders in humanitarian issues, and for us to still not have that human rights protection proclaimed makes us look poor in the eyes of the rest of the world. Yeah, well, I guess first and foremost, the ultimate caveat is that I want to restore citizens' faith in the political process, in democracy. I want people to put their ideas forward, air their problems, tell me what they think their solutions are. Because ultimately, I'm not here to work for a party, I'm not here to work for myself, I'm here to work for the people of Newfoundland and Labrador. Getting people engaged, getting people to care is the first step. Another focus that I want to, I guess, pay keen attention to over the rest of the campaign is reaching out to the youth and the student vote. We hear it all the time. Young people don't vote, and I think it's critically important that young people get engaged, become familiar with the issues as well as how politics work, because they are the future of this country. We keep hearing about this gap. The baby boomers are all going to retire, and then what? So it's critical that we encourage youth to get involved. Students, there was the Maclean's debate last week was broadcast over the internet at the Student Union's pub here in St. John's, Memorial University, and I decided it would be a great opportunity for me to go over and meet some of the keen students. There was a room of about 75 people. I was disappointed that I was the only candidate from any party, from any riding that attended that event. Another thing I'd like to focus on, and something that strengthened democracy, or foresight democracy, strengthened democracy, we want to empower regions, and specifically, I guess, looking at rural regions, we want to make sure that every opportunity to maximize the potential of each part of this country is recognized. So often we hear stories of people having to leave the small town and move to the big city for either education or to find employment. We hear businesses having to fold. Newfoundland and Labrador, a common issue that continues to evolve is the concept of resettlement. Communities are literally folding, and the provincial government is actually paying people to leave and move to the big cities so they don't have to focus on providing government services there. And I think that's sad. There's so much culture and history here in Newfoundland, and we seem to rely a lot on tourism. I think it's important that all parts of our province has the opportunity to thrive and maximize their potential. And I'd like to see steps taken to help promote businesses in towns such as Harbour Grace or Carbonear or Placentia, Bay Roberts, etc. We're also seeing a unique situation with this riding where the city of St. John's is going through urban sprawl to the point where St. John's neighbors are now becoming cities themselves. In fact, Conception Bay South, I believe, boasts over 25,000 people, yet it's not part of St. John's. It's its own town, it's its own city, and it's actually part of the Avalon riding. And I think that's another interesting question, how can we get some congruence? There seems to be evolution of Conception Bay South, another town called Paradise. We're seeing a lot of people buying homes and building properties there, but there's not a lot of businesses. You might live in CBS, you might live in Paradise, but you have to work in St. John's, you have to shop in St. John's, you have to play in St. John's. So I guess what I'm getting at is there's going to be importance in making sure that all three levels of government start communicating and collaborating. We've already seen some wars develop between St. John's and another town, Mount Pearl, over who should pay for the roads, who should have the public transit. Right now, you cannot get into Paradise or Conception Bay South using the St. John's public transit system. So everyone needs to own a car or be willing to jog 30 kilometers a day. There's also been a very negative relationship over the past decade between the various premiers of Newfoundland Labrador and the various prime ministers of Canada. And one thing Strength and Democracy wants to focus on is working together with other parties and trying to reach consensus rather than just fight and argue and put people down. We'll stand up and work with anyone. We'll support other people's ideas if it's right for the people that we represent. No, I think I've given you a good overview of everything about me and what my campaign's all about. Do you... Yeah. Excellent. That would be great. If you want to, do you need a picture of me? You can go to my blog and pluck. I've got a couple up there. Actually, yeah, you can steal that one too. The one with me and the dog statue is probably the best picture of me that you could use. Yeah. Let me see if I can't even remember. I'll send you the link separately. It's jennifermccreath.blogspot. I'm not sure if I link directly to that or I just point people to one of my websites on Twitter. jennifermccreath.com. Yeah, there's a link to my blog on jennifermccreath.com. Yeah, well, thanks so much for reaching out. I'm glad there's people interested in covering this because I think it's a rather unique and important story. Oh, really? Cool. What part? Oh, wow. Oh, okay, so you know about this place. Great. Yeah. Oh, for sure. It's we've come a long way. Now, I guess it's exciting to see that there's now a group at Memorial University, a trans support group, and they get 25 people showing up once a month for meetings. So I'd like to hope that, not that I want to take credit, but I'd like to think my hard work has made life a little easier for trans people today than it was 8 years ago. Yeah, I think ultimately I mean, you gotta pay the rent, and it's all about where the best jobs are. I've looked all around. I've been applying. I've applied to jobs all over Canada, but it just seems my profile's higher here, and I'm getting interviews here where I'm not even getting interviews elsewhere. And I guess it got to the point where I realized might as well stop worrying about leaving and just declare that this is home. and just focus on building a life here. Sounds wonderful. Thanks so much. Take care. Bye. Bit of an echo there. I'm still on here? Yeah. Oh my, that was a bit of a long interview. You're still recording. 35 minutes into this. Yahoo Canada, it's a national article. Wow, and it's going live later today. Woo! Thanks for watching, everyone. I'm Jennifer McCreath. It's August 11th, 2015.